Assalamu alaikum. We'll be starting the program very soon, so please make your way inside the main hall.
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. We are starting the program now, so for those who are outside, please make your way inside. All right. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. I'm really excited to welcome you all back to the second installment of our new history biography series at ISOC. Inshallah, we'll be today hearing about the life of Mimsar Sinsan, the great Ottoman classical architect. Today we have the privilege of having Dr. Mohsin Ali with us. Dr. Mohsin is a close friend, and just a bit about him, he pursued his Alimiya degree at Nadwat al-Ulama in Lucknow, India. He spent 5 years there. And afterwards, he came back and he completed his PhD in Islamic studies at UCLA. His dissertation was on Islamic historiography in South Asia. So he looked at the writings of prominent intellectuals and scholars there, such as Shibli Nu'mani and Abul Hassan Ali Nadwi and other scholars, many other scholars, and analyzed what they wrote about Islamic history. Presently, he is an instructional designer at the UCLA Library, and I'm very privileged to have his office right next to mine, so it's the best part about going in person to work. We can get to meet and talk. And without further ado, Dr. Mohsin.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Inna alhamdulillah wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. I'm grateful to be here today. I don't get to come out to Orange County very often, but I have a special connection with this masjid because my parents were married here a long time ago, and my nani, my grandma used to come here, so I'm always happy to visit here whenever I can. Inshallah, today I'll be talking about, as was mentioned, the Ottoman Muslim architect Sinan, often referred as Mimsar Sinan. Mimsar just means architect, so the architect Sinan, in the context of Ottoman history. Just by a show of hands, who's already familiar with Sinan? A little bit. I see someone a little bit. Okay. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, I'll start off by showing some of Sinan's more famous masjids. This is the Shehzadeh Masjid in Istanbul, the famous Suleymaniye Jami' Masjid in Istanbul as well. This is the Selimiye Masjid in Edirne, which is not in Istanbul. It was an older capital of the Ottoman Empire, now on the European side of Turkey. This is the Sultan Ahmad Masjid, very iconic. This isn't Mimsar's masjid, but it was designed by his student. And it's based on the classic design that Mimsar left behind. So it's a continuation of Sinan's legacy. And then the Fatih Masjid, originally built before Sinan, but the original building, as we'll talk about later tonight, was destroyed, and it was rebuilt on Sinan's design. So it's another example of his design. So I'm going to be asking a lot of questions. So I'm gonna need participation. I'm used to sitting silently in classes when people don't want to answer, and I'm happy to do that here today too. So in the buildings I just showed, what seems to be a common quality of all of these architectures? Yeah. A lot of domes, yes, a lot of domes. And I found this image on Reddit, but it does a good job of showing how what's called the classic Ottoman masjid style with this large centralized dome is unique when compared to other masjids from other parts of the world and other time periods. This large dome, centralized dome structure is considered classical, quote unquote, classical Ottoman architecture. And this is Mimsar Sinan's legacy, this huge centralized dome. And we'll be talking about why that was. Right. So there's been a lot written about Sinan, a lot of research done on him. And for about a century, there's been two dominant trends when writing and researching about Sinan. There's a Turkish nationalist trend, which basically presents Sinan as a unique Turkish genius. The Turkish Republic, when it was formed in the aftermath of the Ottoman Empire, wanted to distance itself from its Ottoman past. It wanted to be secular. It wanted to be quote unquote rational. But in Sinan, it saw a Turkish hero that they could appropriate. So they've done a lot of research on Sinan, his work, his life, but from a very secular nationalist perspective. So they focus on him as ethnically and racially Turkish, and that he represented Turkish secular rationality. Everything he built was based off of, according to this approach, a very secular, rational, mathematical principles. And it's the evidence for calling him Turkish is nowhere to be found. Most likely he wasn't Turkish. He was Armenian or Greek, maybe Albanian. But to prove that he was really Turkish, they exhumed his body, his dead body, to measure his skull, to prove that his skull fit a quote unquote Turkish racial quality. And his skull has been lost ever since. So that's how far they really wanted to promote him as very racially and ethnically Turkish. On the other hand, and in response to a lot of that, there's been what's called a world historical approach. The image I have here is the largest church, the cathedral in the city of Rome, the Vatican City of Rome, St. Peter's Basilica, designed by architects and artists like Michelangelo. They were contemporaries of Sinan. Sinan lived during the Renaissance. And so in the world historical approach, they like to place him within this Renaissance context, where just as artists and architects like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo were inspired by the Roman legacy to build things like St. Peter's Basilica, the largest structure in Rome today, Sinan, their contemporary, was similarly in the same context, being inspired and really taking on that Roman legacy when he's building his domes. So this is the world historical approach. What's missing in these two dominant approaches? What don't we hear about Sinan? What part of his life? Islam, yeah. I mean, he was Muslim, right? He lived in a very Islamic context. And in both of these approaches, that's been absent. And so today, for much of the presentation, this is like my framing question, like how did Sinan draw on Islamic law, ethics, and patronage to shape cultural and civilizational goals? Like, he was Muslim in a very Islamic context. How did that affect him? Where do we see that? A lot of my presentation today draws on Sinan's own autobiographies. So Sinan was quite proud of his achievements, and he wrote down a lot, and he dictated to a scribe quite a bit about his life and the things he had built because he wanted people to remember it. Both of the former approaches, the Turkish nationalist and the world historical, largely ignores Sinan's writing. It's full of poetry, and he throws in Quranic verses, and they think that's not very historical. But it's his words, it's his reflections. And so I'm going to be quoting a lot from his own words to better capture Sinan's personality today. I'm also very much influenced by the Turkish-American historian at Harvard, Necip Polu, and so I'll be drawing on her work as well tonight. Okay, so first I just want to talk about Sinan's early life, from 1489 when he was born around to 1538, before he became a royal architect. And I want to think about it in the context of what's going on in the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic context at this time, because a lot's changing. Here's a map of different moments of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire started as a minor kingdom in Anatolia. In fact, it wasn't likely that it would become a major kingdom. It was almost completely destroyed by Tamerlane. Yet eventually it did become to dominate. And during this period, when it was a minor kingdom in the Anatolian Peninsula, it didn't have like a strong idea that they're going to be the leaders of the Muslims or leaders of the Islamic world. But as by 1453, this purple areas, when they conquered it, including the city of Istanbul, they began to take on a more imperial identity. They want centralized control, and they're thinking of themselves more as a global empire. And then, right when around the time of Sinan's life, the Sultan Salim conquers Egypt and Syria and Hijaz. And now they're the rulers of the major Muslim centers. Sultan Salim takes on the title of Khadim al-Haramain. And it's during Sinan's life that the Ottoman Empire now begins to take on this identity of, we are the leaders of the Muslim world. We are the protectors of the Muslims. We are responsible for Islam now, right? So it's Sinan's time when this shift is happening to this Islamic identity, with titles like Khadim al-Haramain. When he becomes a royal architect, it's under the Sultan Suleiman, and Suleiman takes on the title of Khalifa. So he becomes Khalifa just like the Abbasid and Umayyad Khalifs. This is Sinan's time. Right? So it's important to keep in mind that he's living at a time when now the leaders of the Ottoman Empire we are the leaders of the Muslim world. We are the protectors of Sharia. This is very much their new identity that they're cultivating. That also means that they're ruling over a population that is mixed, and a lot of their subjects who are Muslim are not knowledgeable about Islam nor practicing, so they take it upon themselves to enforce parts of Islamic law. So they're very keen on enforcing everybody needs to start praying 5 times a day. That means we need to start building masjids in villages. We need masjids for Friday prayers. And we need scholars and teachers to be funded and make sure people know Islamic law, right? So this is part of what's going on as Sinan is growing up. This is his context. So I've mentioned he was born around 1489. He's born to most likely a Christian, Greek or Armenian family. Definitely a Christian family from Anatolia, from what today would be Turkey. So even though the Ottoman Empire is taking on the Islamic character, it's also changing in other ways. So before its power was rooted in alliances with powerful Turkish groups, but now the Ottoman sultans don't want to share power with other Turkish groups. So they've started this unique elite military called the Janissaries that are loyal only to the Sultan. And the way they do that is that they enslave young boys from their Christian subjects. And they convert them, they train them, and then these converted young former Christians come to be the leaders of the empire, loyal only to the Sultan. So Sinan is among them, right? Now I bring that up because although they're taking on the Islamic character, that doesn't mean that we whitewash everything they did. By accounts of all four madhabs, you can't enslave your own subjects as rulers, Muslim or non-Muslim. But nonetheless, this is how they were trying to solidify power. So Sinan was a former Christian, was enslaved, converted, grew up, trained, and he was trained as a carpenter. Then he had a very successful career as a janissary, part of this elite Ottoman military unit, as a military engineer. He really stood apart because he was able to build bridges and ships and fortifications, even masjids, very quickly and very reliably, which is how eventually he got noticed and got promoted to becoming the chief royal architect in 1539. This was also the time where he got the opportunity to travel, because the Ottoman Empire is engaged in battles in Europe, is engaged in battles in Egypt, and against the Safavids in Iran. So Sinan is traveling everywhere, and in his autobiography, he mentions how in his travels, he learned so much from buildings that existed and buildings that had become ruined. He's very interested in this legacy, in these Muslim lands. So he writes, later, like a moving compass, drawing a circumference, I long to move to other lands. For a time, I traversed the Arab and Persian lands in the service of the Sultan Salim and acquired a sought-after bit of wisdom from the heights of every Iwan and a provision of knowledge from every ruined Sufi lodge. Right? So the word Iwan, it refers to these huge arches that you can see in a lot of Mamluk and Timurid architecture. So he's very keen on learning from these. So it's not just that he's interested in Roman architecture. He's, in his own words, he's very interested in what previous Muslims were building. This is a more common type of masjid interior that he would have seen. What do you notice here that might be different from some of the big domed masjids we'll look at later? Yeah, how is it different from this space right here? Yeah, right, so it's not as open as we have it here, right? So this is something important to keep in mind because this is something Sinan's gonna be thinking a lot about. So Sinan mentions in his autobiography that how it was that he eventually got recommended to the position of chief architect. And he mentions how on a campaign in Europe, he quickly built a bridge over a river. And his commanding officer, whose name was Lufti Pasha, who's pictured here, another former slave, converted, and now a janissary, told Sinan to also build a tower by the bridge so that they could protect the bridge if the enemies came back. And Sinan disagreed. He told him, look, if the enemies come back, we can destroy the bridge, and if we need to, I can rebuild it. But if I build a tower and they take the bridge and they take the tower, then we won't be able to get it back. So, and this was not common to disagree with a superior officer. And Sinan writes about how upset Lufti Pasha became. He writes, Lufti Pasha was offended by my position, by my opposition. This humble servant, meaning Sinan, was greatly troubled since the late Lufti Pasha had been offended by my contradiction of his views and my action in opposition to his will. And I worried that at some point, I might deservedly suffer his harm. So now Sinan's afraid because Sinan's idea was the one that was adopted. And then Lufti Pasha becomes the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. So Grand Vizier is like the prime minister. It's the most powerful position after the Sultan. And so now his officer that he had made angry is now the second most powerful position in the empire. And in that position, he recommends Sinan to become the royal architect. Despite the fact that at that moment he was angry, he still recognized that Sinan was extremely skilled. And he found value in the fact that Sinan was honest with his principles. Right, so, and this is an early indication of the type of person Sinan is. He's very principled, and he will voice his opinion about what is right, even when he's afraid of his superiors, right? And that got him the position. When it was offered to him, he didn't want to accept it immediately, because being a Janissary commander was more lucrative. You got paid more, you could become more powerful. It's from the Janissary leadership that the Grand Viziers would be chosen. It was a pathway to a lot of power, prestige, and money. So Sinan mentions, the thought of abandoning my career as a Janissary gave me pain. But in the end, I accepted the position of being the royal architect, seeing it an opportunity to build many masjids and thereby fulfill many desires in this world and the next. Right? So in his words, he's not saying he was motivated by a love for mathematics or geometry, nor impressed by previous Roman legacy. In his words, he chose to become an architect so he could build masjids, fulfill desires for this world and the next. And then he continues to write, praise be to God who guided us to this. Had God not guided us, we had surely never been guided. Where is that from? Who can recognize? Where is that from? Yeah, from Surah Al-A'raf. So he quotes the verse from the Quran. And then, so he's saying, like, he's expressing thanks. That if Allah hadn't guided me to Islam, I would never have become a royal architect. Right? So this is what he's saying. If it hadn't been for Allah guiding me, making me a Muslim, everything I attained would have been impossible. And then he mentions how he was able to serve many Ottoman sultans and build paradise-like mosques that remind people of Jannah. All right, so this is just a taste of some of his words. He mentioned he wanted to build masjids. Like, how did that idea come about? If you look at that time, the other two Muslim empires, the Safavids and the Mughal Empire, they didn't really build many masjids. If you think about the most important monuments in those lands, their tombs, their mausoleums, their palaces and castles, really the big masjids like the Badshahi Masjid, those came after this time period, right? So the reason why Sinan is thinking about masjids is because a lot of the Ottoman elite who are taking on this new identity of Islamic leaders, they're interested in funding the building of masjids. So it's not like Sinan is unique in thinking about masjids. No, he's the product of that culture at that time, where lots of important sultans, viziers, the royal family, they want to send money to build masjids and other charitable projects, other waqf. Right? So that's why that's on his mind, because there's like people are interested in it, and Sinan's like, you know what, this is what I do with my life. And an example of that is Sultan Suleiman's wife, Hurram Sultan, who in her own right is a very interesting personality. She also was initially a slave given as a gift to Sultan Suleiman, who freed her and married her, made her his official wife, and took on no other wives when she was his wife. A lot of interesting letters that they can still be found that they exchanged. But what's important for our purposes is that Hurram Sultan, also called Hurram Khaski Sultan, she funded a lot of projects. The very first thing Sinan did as a royal architect was build her complex in Istanbul. Here's a later model of what it originally looked like. Actually, not even originally, because it originally only had one dome during Sinan's time. But it was a masjid. It was a large public soup kitchen where anyone could eat for free. It was a school, and it was a hospital. Right, so this was Sinan's first project. And what's interesting is that the masjid, it was called, so Haski Sultan is her name. It was called the Haski Sultan Jami'. What does Jami' mean in the context of masjids? Huh? No. Yeah, the Friday prayer masjid. right? So you have masjids. When the word masjid is used in these chronicles and contexts, the masjid is where people pray 5 times a day. But if it's a masjid for Jum'ah, those are called jami', right? So the Ottomans are interested in masjids, but they're also interested in jami'as. They're building large masjids where people from multiple neighborhoods have to come together and pray together. Because they're thinking about, the Ottoman Empire is interesting because it's very multi-ethnic. Like for example, Khurram Sultan, she's Polish. Sinan is Greek or Armenian. Lufti Pasha is like Hungarian or Baltic. Like they're different ethnicities, right? And you have different neighborhoods. But the Jami' for Friday, a bunch of different neighborhoods have to come together of that area and pray together in the Friday prayer. And they have to take the name of the Sultan as a Khalifa in the khutbah, right? So they're really, the most powerful Ottomans don't want just a masjid. They want to build a Jami'. Right? That's going to be a big result of why Sinan builds some of these great monuments. As I mentioned, they were also felt responsible for the Haramain. So it wasn't just a Turkish interest. It was more of a global interest. And so Sultan Suleiman, among the projects that he assigned to Sinan, he sent Sinan to Mecca to survey it and design the old Ottoman walls. So this is Sinan's design. They don't exist anymore. Since the Saudi government extended the mataf, they took down those old Ottoman walls. But for a long time, they were iconic. Like if you had a painting of Mecca, you had the walls. This is Sinan's design, these walls of Mecca. You can see an image here of a painting. These are Sinan's design. And Sultan Suleiman sent him there because as a Khadim al-Haramain, he wanted to make sure it was protected. Similarly, or you can hear a more recent picture before it was taken down of what these walls looked at. And one thing Sinan did, because he has an interest in the past, he tried to reuse a lot of the material from the Abbasid and the Umayyad times. And for a long time, Muslims believed that in the Ottoman architecture, there was even parts of it that might have gone to the time of the Sahaba. Because Sinan was keen to reuse things. He didn't want to get rid of it. They had a history. So if he could, he wanted to put it back into it. And so when it was taken down, a lot of people were very emotional because there was a lot of connections to these Ottoman walls. Similarly, Sinan's role in Jerusalem is unclear. We know he was there. It seems likely that Sultan Suleiman had him renovate the Dome of the Rock and part of the Haram al-Sharif. But what we do know is that his wife, Khurram Sultan, she had Sinan, just like in Istanbul, he had built the soup kitchen and the hospital and the school, same thing built in Jerusalem. And in fact, this is the largest charitable waqf in Jerusalem. Was designed by Sinan, funded by Khurram Sultan. It's unfortunate that a lot of what Khurram Sultan did, it was left out of Ottoman history because she was a powerful position in politics and many people didn't like her. But we know of these projects because of her waqf. So this was legally documented and registered that this is in her name, that she's funding it. So when we look at the waqf records, we know all of the things she funded. And it wasn't just this. In fact, since the Ottomans are now thinking of themselves as the leaders of the Muslim world, they're looking at, okay, what did the previous Khalifas do? The Umayyads and the Abbasids. Like Harun al-Rashid's wife, Zubaydah. She had so many water works funded from Kufa to Mecca. Khurram Sultan took Zubaydah as her example. And so she paid for a lot of wells and water channels for people on the routes going for Hajj and Umrah. Because she imagined herself like, okay, what would Zubaydah do? That's what I want to do. And then her daughter similarly did the same thing. Even the walls of Jerusalem, there's some evidence that Sinan designed those. So the old city of Jerusalem, still the walls are still up. Those are Ottoman walls from Sultan Suleiman's time. And it's likely Sinan had some hand in designing it, even if he wasn't directly involved in building it. And Jerusalem is interesting because it's divided up into different neighborhoods. So you've had the Haram al-Sharif, you've had the Muslim quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Christian quarter. This is the time when Jews are being kicked out of Europe, out of Spain. There's programs going on. And this is also the time where the quote-unquote New World in North America and South America, Native Americans are being genocided in the name of Christianity. And this is the time when the Ottomans are telling persecuted people in Europe, come to our lands and you'll be safe. And you have lots of Jews coming to resettle in Ottoman Empire, and they're being invited to even come to Jerusalem. In fact, Jewish writings during this time present the Ottoman sultans as a messiah, as a savior of the Jews. Yeah, this is the time. This is the sign that was built during this time period. During this time period on Bab al-Khalil, which is right here, there's this large sign that still exists. Can anyone read it? So the first part is La ilaha illallah, Na Muhammad Rasulullah, Ibrahim Khalilullah, right? Why are they putting this sign at this moment? To signify that everyone who respects Ibrahim is welcome in this area, right? So this is an example of our legacy in history that Sinan was a part of. Not only that, Jewish sources. So this is something that's not found in Muslim sources, but this is something found in Jewish sources, is that Sinan is the one who renovated the Western Wall. So today, this is the most holy site for Jews. Before this time period, this was not a holy site for Jews. Jews never really went, in the history of Jewish history, to the Western Wall. Sinan, under Suleiman's advice, cleared out a part of the area for Jews to come and visit. And then since that time, it became the holy Jewish site. So just the extent to which they were involved in improving the lives of their subjects, Muslim or otherwise, and the way in which Sinan was quite possibly involved. Okay, so that was all just to give you the context of Sinan's time, the Islamic context. Now, what I want to do is spend a little more time talking about some specific projects, how he solved problems, and how he described it in his own words, to really appreciate what he was doing. So just to recap, he became the chief royal architect in 1539, and he remained in that position until 1588 when he passed away. And I'll talk about 3 specific projects. His project to get water to Istanbul, called the Kırıkçeşme water system, and specifically this aqueduct of Maglova aqueduct. Then I'll talk about the Suleymaniye Masjid and the Salimiye Masjid, right, in that order. So Istanbul, during Sinan's time, the population had become huge, about 100,000 estimated, right? And that presented a challenge. You need to have water for all these people. Now, for the elite, they could dig wells. They could dig wells and find water. There was some amount of underground water since Byzantine times. And then they could rent out their fountains or sell some of that water. They did the effort to build it so they could sell it, profit off of it. But that still left most of the Muslims in the city in a difficult situation. Not just for drinking, but how can you build masjids and have wudu fountains if you don't have access to free water, right? So this was on Sinan's mind early on. And there's some accounts that won't get in details, but whenever Suleiman was on a hunting trip, he would try to get him to think about, oh, just water sources maybe we could use. And the thing is, Istanbul has been an important city for centuries, under the Romans and under the Byzantines. And so Sinan proposed, let's look up what they were doing. Let's do a dig to find their water channels. because we know that there's a lot of water in the ground a few hundred kilometers north of Istanbul. And somehow the Romans were tapping into that and bringing it to Constantinople. Let's study what they were doing and try to rebuild that for our new city, right? And so that's what he suggested. And eventually that's what he accomplished. I mean, there's hundreds of kilometers of water system called the Kırkçeşme water system that Sinan designed, developed, and renovated. And that fed water to the city for hundreds of years. Even today, that system still exists and still gives water to that city. And he talks about his plan. He mentions putting his trust in God. This humble servant measured the heights and depths of the valleys with an aerial balance, some type of instrument. And while searching from place to place for those ancient aqueducts and pondering this great task, I prayed to God and said, "O omnipotent creator, O all-powerful, all-compelling one, of what value is this useless, foolish ant that his words in the service of the Solomon of the age should be held in esteem?" So this is what he's thinking about. He's searching for the Roman channels and aqueducts, trying to figure out how did they do this, and saying, I'm like an ant. What of use in my? Why is he calling himself an ant? Where is that coming from? Huh? Yeah, but where's the ant metaphor coming from? The Quran, right? In the Quran when Sulaiman is passing by and the ants are afraid and he hears them. So he's comparing himself to an ant and the Sultan to Prophet Sulaiman. Like that's how lowly he is. How can he go about doing this great task if Allah doesn't help him? Right, this is what he's writing about. And this was a major project, so he convinced the Sultan to fund it. And it cost about 1/4 of the empire's budget just on this water project, 1/4, because it required thousands of people working to uncover hundreds of kilometers worth of area to discover the water channels. And most of the water is underground. So it's challenging to figure out where the water is running without digging up a lot of it. Last year in my home, I had a slab leak in my backyard. It took a while with the jackhammer to figure out where that leaking pipe was. Right? So imagine doing that over hundreds of kilometers worth. So it's a very expensive project. And he writes down how he's doing it. Signs of geometry, but what's interesting is that based on the foliage and plant growth. So he's taking note, like what kind of plants are growing and how did that change? So if certain plants and trees are growing, they must be tapping into groundwater. So then he's documenting that and following up that type of path. So he's talking about how he's trying to do this and figure it out. But a lot of the Sultan's entourage are complaining. This is costing too much money. And they're saying that he has no idea what he's doing. He thinks he's like Khidr, who has knowledge of the ghaib. Right? And they tell the Sultan that he's wasting your money. And Sultan Suleiman becomes angry and actually comes to confront Sinan after many years of this project. And then this is what Sinan said that he replied with. He said, "Oh, my Padshah, my Sultan, my king, may you endure forever. May you be abiding in the throne of the state. Who am I that, like the Khidr of the age, I should reveal the fountain of life?" So there was this belief that Khidr al-Islam had discovered a source of water, the fountain of life, and that he lived eternally. And people were blaming Sinan that he's trying to be Khidr with knowledge of the ghaib. And Sinan is saying, "Who am I to be like Khidr?" And he responds, but in my science, I am very much a master. I know what I'm doing. I can show you what I'm doing. I can show you my calculations, my notes. I know where the water is." And Sultan Suleiman says, "Okay, show me right now. Show me what water you've discovered underground right now." And Sinan is afraid because you can get jailed, you can get executed for corruption. There's a lot lying on the line. And so he says that when Sultan Suleiman demanded, "Where is the water? Come and show me," we set out. And when stumbling like a lifeless corpse, because he's so afraid of what the Sultan will do, I reached the second stream and I became weak and fervently praying to God, the all-bounteous, that judge who satisfies the wants of all and never spurns supplication. He's just praying, oh God, please let there be water when I dig in this spot. He's so afraid. And what ends up happening is that Sultan Suleiman sees that indeed there is water underground where Sinan is digging. So he continues to fund the project. And Sinan is successful in rebuilding a lot of the channels. And Sinan writes that, may God do justice to those who hinder good works. May God be, take them to account. And he says, may this pure source find its destination. Let rich and poor drink morning and evening. Right, so this is like a big concern, that there be water for the poor and the rich in the city of Istanbul. And then he goes on to write and encourage other people to say that there's no work of charity like water. Every fountain is like a water carrier by the road, standing and saying to all, water for the sake of Allah. Let him who wishes to lay up pious works along the way build a fountain for the sake of Allah. It is Sinan's hope that he who from this water pleasure takes, should the poor architect and prayer recall. So Sinan writes, I hope that whoever drinks and benefits from the water of Istanbul will make dua for me. O God, may your help be a companion, make his abode near the messenger. So this is Sinan talking about why he's taking such great risks to bring water to the city. These are aqueducts. How many of you are familiar with aqueducts? Yeah, okay. Just engineer. Basically, water runs across the top, right? So when you're bringing water, you've got something in the middle, like a river or a valley. You have to get the water across. So they build these bridge-like structures called aqueducts, and the water has to get across using gravity. And it has to be precise. So Sinan discovered that the Roman formula was that for every about 1,000 meter of it going straight, then it goes 1 meter down and then continues straight. That way the water pressure is not too fast and it's not too slow, right? So this was what Sinan discovered. But he also, so this right here is a Roman aqueduct that you can see if you go to Istanbul today. And this is Sinan's design. Just a few differences that he did. He created more arches in his so that more water and wind can go through when it floods or just a storm. Otherwise, it get destroyed. So he's thinking about, why did these Roman ones get destroyed, and how can I make mine better so it lasts even longer than the Roman ones did? So he's trying to improve upon it by making these design decisions. And you can also see that it's a bit pyramid-like. So he made the top part thinner and the bottom parts thicker, so that and that's one of the reasons why they've lasted longer than the Roman aqueducts, right? So it's not just copying what he sees in the Roman architecture. He's really thinking about how I can make it last even longer than the Romans did. All right. Now we come to the masjids. Right? So when the Muslims conquered Istanbul and they saw the Hagia Sophia, that was one of the most amazing monuments that they had seen. And for a long time, this was the biggest Christian cathedral, and this was the largest domed structure in the world. And a lot of people wanted to build something like it or even better. So Sinan writes, to the engineers of the age and overseers of auspicious monuments, it is manifest and apparent that although formerly buildings constructed in this style did not possess elegance. So he's saying people tried to build in this style, but none of them possessed any elegance. Until I came. And I built first the Shahzada Masjid. And then that allowed me to then to improve upon it and build the Sulaymaniya Masjid, which was the model. So he's saying that he succeeded in building something on the style of Hagia Sophia that was more elegant than anything that had come before. So why is it elegant? Let's talk about. So you can see here, has anyone visited the Hagia Sophia? Okay, so you guys, if you've seen it in person, you know how big it is. And it has a huge dome, right? That's one of its main features. It's about 31 meters across, so 102 feet, larger than a football field, and about 55.6 meters high. When you go inside of it, you can see that it's the domed interior. I have a short video just to give a sense of what it looks like on the inside. So if you're looking at it from the inside and you see the domed interior, what does it feel like? Like what effect does it have? Huh? Museum, extension? What do you mean by extension? Yeah. That's what they want. They want this feeling that this is an open space, right? And so the Hagia Sophia initially the idea was you create an open space and that like the light of God is supposed to fill it, right? And it feels open, right? So that's what the original architects wanted, and that's what Sinan wanted, this open masjid feeling. It was really difficult to do, building a huge dome. And in fact, when Hagia Sophia was first built, the dome collapsed, and they had to rebuild it. This is during the Byzantine time, in the 400s. And the dome actually is not a perfect sphere. It's a little bit elliptical because of the challenges of having a big dome in an open space. What that means is you don't have a lot of columns holding it up. Right? To create that open feeling, you can't have lots of columns holding it up. So that's the first challenge, is that gravity, the weight of the dome pushes down on the pillars. Right? So you don't have that many pillars. How are you going to hold it up? The second challenge of a dome is called thrust. So when you have a spherical structure, it pushes out. Right? So when the pillars are holding it up, they're getting pushed out by the dome, and they start cracking. So you have to figure out, you have to have a big dome, it's heavy. You don't want lots of pillars, but how are they going to hold it in and not push out and not fall down? And that's been the challenge. One way for the Hagia Sophia in its renovations, they've added things called buttresses. You can see them here, you can see them here on the sides, and they basically push the pillars back in. Right? They're support on the sides. You see them when you go see the Hagia Sophia. They're all around it, pushing the dome back in. When Muhammad Fatih conquered Istanbul, he wanted a masjid with a big dome like the Hagia Sophia. This was built in 1463, but it wasn't as big as the Hagia Sophia. And it collapsed. And Muhammad Fatih was not pleased, and he had the architect jailed, possibly executed. And this was something Sinan knew, the risks of being an architect and failing. So when he started building the Suleymaniya, so Sultan Suleiman wanted a jami', and he wanted his jami' masjid to be bigger. And so first Sinan draws up a plan, he says, and Sultan Suleiman approves it. But it takes many years. So, Sinan spends years just building the foundation, right? Underneath the ground, you need to have material pushing back up. And then he takes a long time making sure the domes are perfect. And people start saying he's taking long on purpose because he knows it's going to fail. And Sinan writes about this. People were saying he's not able to remove the scaffolding from the building because its defects would be revealed. And some fool said, there is doubt whether the dome will stand up. The fellow is infatuated with it. Meaning Sinan, people are saying, is obsessed with the dome. But he has no solutions. And he's descending into the valley of man. He's going crazy, and it's not going to work, and it's going to waste money and fall apart. And so then Sultan Suleiman comes to confront Sinan. And he says, he finds him, and he says, why aren't you attending to the jami' and wasting time on unimportant things. Is not the example of my forefather, Sultan Mahmud Khan's architect, sufficient for you? He's like, don't you remember what Sultan Muhammad Fatih did to his architect? Like, isn't that should be enough warning for you not to mess up my masjid? So it's a threat. And so Sinan says that first he said he starts begging Allah, and he makes dua to Allah that to make the foundations of this edifice and let it endure as long as the spheres resolve. And he tells Sultan Suleiman, okay, 2 months and I'll have it ready. And then he writes how for 2 months he didn't sleep and he just worked on it and he was so scared. And then eventually Sultan Suleiman was pleased. And he honored Sinan by giving him the key to it, being allowed the one to open it for the first time. Its dome is not as big as the Hagia Sophia, it's slightly smaller, but inside it, it's still bigger. What's a difference you see between the Hagia Sophia and the Suleymaniya? Huh? Multiple domes. There's more multiple domes. What else? Minarets, but those were added later. What about? Yeah, so it's more. It looks like one single building, whereas the Hagia Sophia looks like a rectangle with a circle on it. Right. So Sinan wanted it to feel unified, not separate things, not separate spaces inside, and not looking like separate spaces outside. We know that when Sinan started building, actually let's have a small video of it too from what it looks like from the inside. When he started building, he starts planning from the inside. He starts planning on what he wants the experience of the worshipers to be that come to the masjid. We know he wanted an open space where everybody lines up in rows without any breaks. We know he wanted to feel like everybody, he says, is under one canopy because they all believe in one Allah and underneath leadership of one prophet. That's why he wanted one dome, and he wants people to feel like this without any breaks or columns in between. And the way he is able, the Suleymaniya also doesn't have that many buttresses. They're actually hidden in the wall, so it feels more open from the inside and outside. The multiple domes have this function. So the main dome has a thrust, but then he has 2 semi-domes. And so those also have a thrust, and they thrust back. Right? So for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. So that main dome is being pushed out, but they're being pushed in by the semi-domes. And then he's got quarter domes that are now pushing back against those semi-domes. And then those quarter domes are then put on the pillars. Right? So you don't need lots of buttresses pushing it in. You don't need lots of columns on the inside. Right? So it was very mathematically worked out. Right? But he's not only thinking about what it looks like. He's also thinking about what the experience will feel like. So when we come to a masjid, we spend a lot of time listening. And we know from waqf documents that the masjids had specific qaris, morning and night. After Fajr, certain surahs would be read, Surah Yasin, during the daytime, and all throughout the day with beautiful voices. In fact, there was a fatwa during Sinan's time that people are not allowed to go to other jami'as only for the sound, because people would start going to some over others because some qaris were better. So Sinan is thinking about the sound as well, because it's about the experience of the worshipers. The problem with the dome is that sound is not reflected equally. What a dome does is that it makes sound bounce to specific places. And so if you're not in that specific spot, what ends up happening is you're not getting a clear sound. So we know Sinan is thinking about that because in recent excavations, they've discovered in the dome these little holes. And these little holes have these clay bottles whose function is to capture sound and then reflect it back so that sound is more evenly distributed and you don't get this problem of specific spots only. So this is designed by Sinan, not only for how it looks, but how it sounds without a mic. And you can recite the Quran and it will flow equally around the whole masjid space. Right? Because Sinan is thinking about who are the users? What are they going to be doing here? Listening and praying. And needs to be fit for that. Final masjid, case study, the Salimiya Masjid. This is in Edirne, which is on the European side. So it's not Istanbul, but it's actually the biggest, the dome. It's even bigger than Hagia Sophia. And so Sinan writes that the European architects, the non-Muslims, were saying that we have scored a victory over the Muslims. And their statements in accord with their perversely false views to the effect that the construction of a dome such as that is very difficult. Were it possible to build one like it, the Muslims would have done it. It pained and endured in the heart of this humble servant. So I exerted myself in the construction of the above-mentioned Friday mosque, and with the help of God, the Lord the Judge, showed my capabilities during the reign of Sultan Salim Khan and made this exalted dome to exceed the Hagia Sophia. So he's saying these European architects were saying, Muslims can't build a dome bigger than the Hagia Sophia. And if they could have, they would have done it, and they can't. Sinan, by this age, is like in his 80s. And he's at that age, he's saying, I need to prove them wrong to show that we can do it even better, a bigger one. And the Salimiya is bigger, both its diameter, but also the height of the dome than the Hagia Sophia. And he uses a different design, not multiple domes, but an octagonal structure that distributes the thrust and the weight. And then he also puts the pillars into the wall so you can't really see it sticking out that much. And it's an even more open space in Suleymaniya. So we can see that, yes, there is this, he's interested in the Roman legacy, the Byzantine legacy, but he's interested as a Muslim in creating a space for Islamic worship, right? And without that Islamic context, you really miss Sinan's motivations, and you really miss who he was without that Islamic context. And just final words of what Sinan ends one of his autobiographies with. He says, may God be exalted. What is this beautiful place, talking about this masjid, sublime mosque, the Aqsa Mosque, like of the exalted Kaaba? They say that Khidr designed the Hagia Sophia. Do not think this Khidr-like man a mere mason to be. So they say that people think that Khidr built the Hagia Sophia, and that's true. Muslims began to think, after the Fatih Masjid was not successful, that it's impossible to build it. Roman sources said that an angel came and built the Hagia Sophia. And when those sources were translated into Persian and Turkish, they took that to mean Khidr al-Islam built the Hagia Sophia. And so Muslims, after the Fatih Masjid, believed it's impossible. And so Sinan said, no, it's not impossible, right? It's very possible. And he was very motivated to prove them wrong as well. Not just the non-Muslim architects, but Muslims who believe things like this are impossible. The water system is impossible. How can you figure out what the water is? Suleymaniya is impossible. Salimiya is impossible. And each time he's saying, no, we don't need to wait for a Khidr. We don't need to wait for a miracle. There's a lot that humans can do. And so just concluding reflections. One of the things that I appreciate when I look at Sinan's life, striving for excellence and long-term thinking. He's not just trying to build something for his immediate supervisor or the Sultan. He's thinking about hundreds of years. There's subtleties to everything he's doing so that it'll last hundreds of years. Principled stance, whether it's against a Sultan or a supervisor, right? He's respectful, but he's willing to disagree. And then balancing confidence and humility before God. So he's very confident in his abilities. He knows that he has spent a lot of time studying. He knows he spent a lot of time perfecting his craft, but he's always making dua to God. And he's always worried that, if without Allah's help, he won't be able to build anything. Right? So there's this balance between this confidence in our ability to accomplish things and the humility that it's only from Allah if we're able to do it. Right? He's got this balance in his autobiographies. And then the last part, this critically and comparatively reading sources for history. Because unfortunately, the ways in which Islamic ethics and the desire to please Allah and to please the Prophet, the way in which that has motivated people in history, it's left out. Even when it's literally there in the books, it's been left out. So for Muslims, it's really important that we able to provide that Islamic context when it's there, that we had individuals that accomplished things that no one have been able to do again. And they were motivated for the love of Allah and the love of the Prophet ﷺ and helping Muslims. And Sinan embodies that. So with that, I just want to conclude. If there's questions I can answer afterwards, but I do want to leave time for people to do wudu and get ready for Isha. قولي قولي هذا واستغفري ولكم فاستغفروه الرحيم واخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Assalamu alaikum. If there are any questions, we'll have like a 5 to 10 minute Q&A session after Aisha. So if you guys want to stick around. Assalamu alaikum. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
مستقيم واعتدلوا الله أكبر الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. كلا إذا بلغت التراقي وقيل من راق وظن أنه الفراق والتفت الساق بالساق إلى ربك يومئذ المساق فلا صدق ولا صلى ولكن كذب وتولى ثم ذهب إلى أهله يتمطى أولى لك فأولى ثم أولى لك فأولى أيحسب الإنسان أن يترك سدى ألم يك نطفة من مني يمنى ثم كان علقة فخلق فسوى فجعل منه الزوجين الذكر والأنثى أليس ذلك بقادر على أن يحيي الموتى الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. إن الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب والمشركين في نار جهنم خالدين فيها أولئك هم شر البرية. إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات أولئك هم خير البرية. جزاؤهم عند ربهم جنات عدن تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا. رضي الله عنهم ورضوا عنه ذلك لمن خشي ربه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. We would like to thank Dr. Mohsin Ali for joining us tonight and giving us a great presentation on Mimsar Sinsan, one of the greatest Ottoman, and some people say one of the greatest architects of all time. So Jazakumullah khair. Hopefully you can come back and educate us more. We're gonna, after Sunnah and Witr, we're gonna have a 5 to 10 minute Q&A session and longer if need be, if that's okay with you. So after Sunnah and Witr, we'll come back and inshallah we're gonna have about a 5 to 10 minute Q&A session with Dr. Ali. Assalamu alaikum. One of the questions I had was about Mimar Sinan, and then you also mentioned that one of the generals in the army, they were Christians, and then they were enslaved as children, and then eventually they converted to Islam. I mean, this is kind of not about like the architecture itself, but in general, like, you know, and then Mimar Sinan became like a janissary and then became an architect. But this is a theme that I have seen like in the Ottoman Empire, where they would, you know, when they acquired land, they would enslave kids and they would train them, teach them about Islam, and then sometimes convert them to Islam. So was there ever like ill feeling, you know, amongst those converts? Because to my understanding, some of it was forced, right? What did they ever have ill feelings? And how do you go from growing up as like a Christian boy being enslaved to being like one of the greatest Ottoman Islamic architects of all time?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Hi, in the corner. You guys can take it outside, please, if you don't mind. Jazakallah khair. So yeah, the question about the Ottoman devshirme system, where they would enslave mostly Christian boys, and then they would convert them and then train them if there was any ill will or ill feeling. We don't really know. I mean, it's possible, but it's also, we know that being a slave of the Sultan during this time was seen as a mark of distinction, and freeborn Muslims at this time could not become janissaries. And so being a slave of the Sultan during this period was, in a weird way, a mark of honor. Now, we do know that they still kept in touch with their Christian families. In fact, we know Sinan tried to get his nephews, his brother's children, to convert and become Muslim as well. We know that from one of his documents. I believe it was Lufti Pasha, who became Grand Vizier. He was able to appoint his brother to be the Greek Orthodox Pope. So Lufti Pasha was Grand Vizier, and his brother was the head of the Greek Orthodox. So they still kept in touch and had connections with their Christian non-Muslim families. Sometimes they would help them move up, like Lufti Pasha did. Sometimes they would encourage them to convert as well, like Sinan tried to get his nephews to convert. So I think, and it wasn't on mass scale enslavement in this system, and eventually freeborn Muslims also started to enter the janissaries ranks, and it became pretty corrupt within a century. So it didn't last very long, and it wasn't massive enslavement. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is, it's kind of a cross-reference to what happened with Hagia Sophia. If you go back to the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, when he was with Sophronius, he made the pact with the Roman emperor, who was surrendering the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to say, come in and worship here. And he said, no, if I go into this place, then you'll take it over, turn it into a mosque, and that will be the end, right? So it's very interesting that he builds that trust with Christians, and then in the Quran it says in later times Muslims and Christians will be the same. So to me, I always use that in dawah to talk to them. But then when you look at the mosque in Turkey, when was the time where the Muslims started to go into Christian places and to conquer them? Because you see it, the closer to the Prophet, you see the peace that was there and the respect of worship and the belief system in relationship to the previous prophets and teachers, Isa sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Muhammad. So do you know specifically where the Muslims really started to enter into Christianity and to overthrow Christianity? Because there's a time where that wasn't happening.
Yeah, so the question about Muslim conflicts with Christians. So even during the Prophet ﷺ's time, in the Sirah sources, it mentions, like the Battle of Mut'ah, that there were some confrontation with Roman soldiers or people working for the Romans. And then by the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, there were open hostilities with the Byzantine Roman Empire. And that's just the nature of empires in the pre-modern world. They're trying to expand, Muslims are trying to expand out, and there was conflict. The case of Umar in Jerusalem and not praying in the church, slightly different in Istanbul because Constantinople was conquered. Because it's a conquered city and it was not given up, the rules are a little bit different. However, many churches are still preserved. It wasn't like Muslims went and started destroying or converting every single church into masjids. I know it's sometimes it can be difficult to talk about the ISOC, and people think that Muslims are like conquest-minded, but you have historic churches that predate Islam that are found across the old Ottoman lands. You don't find any continuous Muslim masjids from Ottoman times that still continue to exist in these countries that broke off from the Ottoman Empire on the European side, in Greece and in Hungary and these. So it's not even close. Like the amount of preservation of churches and synagogues on the Ottoman side versus complete erasure of masjids on the European side.
So I don't know the ties between the Muslim history and the Christian history when the Knights Templar were fighting with Saladin. For me, there is some vagueness in the historical thing. So there was, because the Muslims, they conquered the Persians, the Romans, the Jews, they conquered everyone. So ultimately, historically, I've only been in Islam for years, but the magnitude, it doesn't set in until you start getting into Salah and you start to realize the power that Allah has blessed the Ummah with and their success in perpetuating the mission of the Prophet. But historically, there's a lot of details that, to me, they're important details because the more you understand how the Muslim conquest was manifest to the different people and who those people were and how they were affected historically, even today, the greater the understanding of what Allah has manifested.
Yeah, true. And then we were not trying to defend everything they did in the past. Like I mentioned, enslaving Christian boys that are subject to the Ottoman Empire, that's not allowed by any madhabs.
Christians were supposed to be like the lamb, the sheep, right? He says, I send you out as sheep amongst the wolves. So they weren't supposed to be ferocious people. So in essence, they defied by trying not by being martyrs. In essence, they were more like the Palestinians today. That's what they were supposed to be like. Because none of them were martyrs. Even his own apostles were not even martyrs, except for only one survived.
Okay.
Very interesting.
Jazakallah khair. Yeah.
And seeing all the wisdom and the knowledge that the Muslims have amassed, I have been blown away. I can't even explain it to non-Muslims.
MashaAllah.
We'll take two more. I think we have one here.
How was the influence of his architecture around non-Muslim and the Muslim countries all over the world.
Yeah, the influence of his architecture on Muslim and non-Muslim countries. We don't know the exactly. We know that European architects were paying attention to what was going on in the Ottoman world. So there was cross-cultural dialogue. It's hard to say like one-to-one what the influences were there. There was a shared sense of participating in like artistic endeavors like the Renaissance. And honestly, it's probably something that needs to be researched further, because most of the focus has been on how Europe influenced Muslims, and it's rarely asked the other way around. In terms of Sinan's influence on other Muslim countries, that's a little bit clear because he did train architects, students. In fact, the one who built the Sultan Ahmad Masjid, I'm forgetting his name. It was a student of Sinan who built called the Blue Mosque, Sultan Ahmad Masjid. And so they sort of carried on a lot of his concepts and they taught it. And historians point out that even in the Taj Mahal and the dome, there are concepts of Sinan's design being applied, and that there was contact between Ottoman architects moving throughout the Persian lands to India as well. And so there it's a little bit clear, and yet it's still something probably that can be explored further. Yeah. I don't know about the new gem. No, I'm not sure. It seems like it would be trying to draw on it, but yeah, I don't know enough about the new one.
So before I ask my question, coming to the Hagia Sophia, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was actually purchased by Muslims. So they paid for the land, but they didn't do anything with it. Just left it as is into a museum, and then later on, when Ortega came, then they decided to like turn it back into a mosque. So
Yeah,
that was
I'm
not. It was not necessarily like they just went and said, "Okay, we're taking over the church." They gave money and for that, because there was a whole argument when they turned it into a mosque. People were asking, and they had to bring this document, and they had legal documentation showing that it was purchased. So they had the chance to turn it, but it's like we keep it as a museum first.
Maybe I'm not fully sure.
Yeah, during the whole time, I think so. I'll definitely will Google that. But my question is regarding the expertise that Sinan had, for his time. I mean, it seems like he was a genius. Like looking from that time, looking for the plans, looking for the foundation, looking at all these different detailed things. So how did he get his training? That's one. And two is, was he the only one, or was there environment to cultivate this type of engineering, nudity, and things like that?
Yeah. So I mean, this would be a great area of research. We do know that he received training. We know a little bit about what that might have looked like. It included both the Euclidean and Greek heritage, as well as more modern things from Europe. There was a fire in the 1800s where all of Sinan's documents and the architectural offices were. So a lot of the sources were lost. They got burned in the fire. But we do know that he thanks a particular teacher who really helped him become a master of certain engineering techniques. So he's a genius, but he was also a product of the Ottoman learning system. And he also organized architects. So as a royal architect, he created a whole corps, a whole units of architects in different cities, and there was more organized training. However, eventually, because it became a famous position, what ended up happening is that viziers would appoint their son to the position, even though they weren't trained. And that type of corruption eventually led to it losing that esteem and prestige. And then they had to rely more on non-Muslim or European architects after that.
Assalamu alaikum. So, my question would be is that for Sinan, as like, did he essentially inspire other scholars or educators or other famous historical figures in the Muslim Ummah centuries after or even decades after? And then who inspired him also? Were there any famous scholars, like, just to name a few names, Ibn Rajab or Ibn Qudama? I wonder, like, do we know, like, any of his Islamic, like, I guess, education? Like, I wonder who are the people that inspired him? Do we know anything about this?
Yeah, I don't know directly. He knew some Arabic and Persian. I mean, he quotes Arabic verses throughout his Quranic verses throughout his autobiography. In terms of who he inspired, his autobiographies were read in the Ottoman Empire for centuries, and people added a lot of like legends to him. And so there is a mythology around him in the Ottoman Empire. So that's part of the challenge, is like trying to look past that and see who he actually was beyond the myth. But yeah, I mean, he did inspire other architects to build great things. In terms of like scholars, I don't know like who he directly was influenced by. He mentions a little bit some Sufis, Haji Bektash, the Bektashi order a little bit, which had some heretical aspects to it, but nonetheless, we see some influence on him in terms of love for the Prophet and the Ahl Bayt. He has, like, sometimes he compares himself, his desire to provide water, inspired by the martyrdom of Hussein, who was cut off from water at Karbala. So he had people that cultivated this love for the Prophet and Ahl Bayt, and he references that. But we don't know exactly like which Islamic scholars. Yeah.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Ali. We would love to have you back, inshallah, soon. So we'll work. This is it, guys. So Jazakallah khair, everyone, for coming. Inshallah, we'll see you soon.